Okay, hello everyone. I am, my name is Awert, and today I'm going to work on building a small time tracking application. The idea is that I work as a contractor, and I often, like every day, I need to log time that I spend on projects. And so far, I've been using Google Sheets for this kind of stuff, and I figured it would be a nice use case to to do it live basically, or it would be a nice use case to build a little application for and stream this. So the application we're going to build is going to be in Node.js first. I'm going to focus on just the backend for now, just so an API, and I'm also going to open source it probably if it's a little bit further along. So we'll see how this goes, and I think if this is interesting, I might do a series of this. I think this first part is just going to be an hour, and maybe if I enjoy it, I'm gonna kind of keep working on this and keep streaming this. So I don't know. I welcome one viewer on Twitch. I'm streaming this on Twitch as well as recording this for later uploading to YouTube. So let's dive in. So on my screen I have my browser and my terminal. I use Vim for programming. If you are a programmer, you're considering learning Vim, maybe don't unless you really want to. It's just something I do because it's just something I've done for the last 20 years, and I'm too stuck in my ways to change. I'm not very good at Vim for some reason. I never really learned the right key combinations. So step one, I had to pick a name for a project. I'm terrible at picking names, so right now it's just the two letters TT for time tracking, and branding can come later. So let's get started. All right, so we have our Git repository. So next step, I'm actually going to use the Curveball framework, which is a framework I also work on. And Curveball has a starter repository, so I don't have to do everything from scratch. So I'm going to use a template. Okay, we have a template now, and I can actually use this. Cool, so we have our files. Next step, I'm going to install the Rpm dependencies. And if I'm not mistaken, I can just start it with npm start. No, not yet. I need to build it first. So I'm going to do that as well. So we use Typescript for everything. And so there's a command to have Typescript compile and automatically run the server. So I'm going to use that command. Script watch. No, that's not what it's called. It's called start watch. Cool. Here we go. We have a running application. Okay, ever since we want to switch to snaps for Firefox, I'm getting weird bugs. I'm really kind of upset with Ubuntu. I want to say you can screw it up. Cool. So this is our API. So right now, when we do get requests on the root, it just returns localhost. So let's take a look at the code for that. Okay, this is the main application. So we have a bunch of routes. And a controller for the home. Okay, this makes sense. It says hello world. All right, so first thing I want to do is I want to install some extra packages. First of all, the Curveball browser package. So what this package does, it's a middleware that basically transforms your JSON into a prettier HTML format. It's useful because it lets you more easily browse your API. It will only transform JSON into HTML if you're actually viewing the API with a browser. So that's installed. Okay. All right. Cool. This looks a lot better. So I think the next thing we kind of need to work on is we need to have some basic endpoints and we need to figure out what those things are. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make just a small text file just to summarize like what we're hoping to achieve. So so first of all, every timesheet is a list of entries. Each entry probably has an ID, has a date, has a person, because we want to support multiple users on this system, has a project, and number of hours. So the way I log stuff is I basically, every entry on my timesheet will have those basic fields. Maybe it's also a good idea to just open. Oh, yeah, wait, that's fine. So this is my basic entry. This is the most important part of the application. Yeah, and I don't really have exact start and end times. The way I will log something is that if I work on 2 projects on a day, I will basically have a date, and it will say something like I'm working on this thing for 2.5 hours or 3 hours. So that's the other thing. I also want to be able to log the hours. So we're not really doing a start and end date, although maybe someone in the future will want this, and we'll add that feature later. It's going to do kind of a very simple version of this that just has number of hours as a fraction. And so we can do hours, and it can be a decimal, but it might even be easier to just store minutes. I doubt anyone will ever care about seconds. I think the lowest granularity I go into is half hour, so minutes should cover that for me. So also for each project, I work for different kinds of projects, sometimes for the same client, and clients typically will want to have a breakdown of how much time was spent on each project. So I'm also going to add a client, and the client will have a name, a project will have a name and a client, and what else? I think this might be it for now. Yeah, this seems like a good starting point. So given that client is kind of the simplest thing here, I'm going to add one more, which is a person. And the person has a name. And yeah, I think this feels like a good starting point. So I'm going to, I'm just going to get started with the client endpoint and see how far we get. So first, one of the things I always want to do is from the home, which is the page you're looking at right now on the right side, I'd like to have basically links to what APIs are available. So given that we already have a broad idea of what those APIs are going to be, I'd like to just type those out. So first thing I'm going to do is I want to add kind of a view. This is a views directory. I call it formats. This view doesn't feel like an exact fit for this. So the format I want to use is HAL. So my only point with this is that I want to move the body from this controller to its own file, and I find it a little bit more elegant. So let's do that. I'll let home. From formats. HAL. There you go, that worked. So instead of this, I think I'm going to add the current version number of the application. So let's see if that works. Import. Does this work? We'll see. Packets might be reserved. Is that reserved? Oh, and it's probably also erroring because we're not using it yet. So okay, so we're getting a real error now. And the error is cannot find module package JSON. Consider using resolve JSON module. Okay, so that sounds like a TypeScript setting I need to change. Just gonna go out of a limb and just guess that this will work, but I have no idea if it will. Resolve JSON module. It's true. Okay, can only be default import using the ES module interrupt flag. Okay. So that means I think I can just do this. Okay. No, got an error. And why? It's very hard. Some of these things are going to be hard to read because I'm trying to keep the resolution somewhat low so people can actually watch the stream. Cannot read properties undefined. Okay. So maybe importing JSON is not as straightforward. Okay, it seems like there's an issue with I need to turn on this other flag called ES module interrupt, and I don't want to do that, but it sometimes causes kind of weird side effects. So I'm going to take a different approach to this. Let's see. So I do want to remove this setting again. And instead of importing, I'm going to just read it. So you might see read file sync and think this is a pretty big no-no because we shouldn't use synchronous operations. But it's less of a big deal because what I'm not going to read this file every time the home is called. So these synchronous operations, the ones that end in sync, basically block the entire application. So normally for most file operations, I/O stuff, you want to use the non-sync operations. But what I'm doing here is I'm reading the package outside all these functions. So I'm only going to do this is only going to run the very first time somebody hits home. Or even before that, I think when the application starts, we'll immediately read in package.json. And as a result, this isn't really going to slow down anything when the application actually runs. So it just slows down the startup time so ever so slightly. This is never going to matter. Next thing is, this needs to be UTF-8. And also we want to parse it. Okay, let's see. Okay, it didn't start, or it didn't open the file yet. So what I'm also going to do is I'm going to, when I'm opening relative files, it works different if you are in the import section and if you actually open stuff from the file system. When you open stuff directly from the file system, it by default uses the path of whatever the process was. So probably this is correct. Yes. But this is also not reliable because it basically expects that the user needs to be in the directory of the project when starting it, and we don't necessarily, I'm not 100% certain that's always going to be true. So instead of relying on this, we can use another fs function, which is join. It's path.join. Path.join is basically a way to concatenate paths together. Oops. Yeah, this looks better. So now you can basically have a directory in front of it, but this still doesn't work. What we want to do is basically make whatever path that's in here irrelevant from how the script was originally called, and the way to do that is the first part we're going to use this special variable called dirname. Dirname ensures, or basically gives us the exact path to the current file, so it would be in the source home formats directory. And the second part is from the directory we want to go a couple of directories up, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then after that open package.json. So I think we got it. No, one too many. There. Cool. So this is correct, and this will be correct for every possible case. Maybe we can also add a name just for fun. There you go, Curveball starter. So this is now all both taken from the package.json. So let's give this a great temporary name. We'll figure out later what the actual name will be. We'll want to fix all these too, but later. Let's not get distracted. Okay, cool. So next step. So what were we doing here? So what I really wanted to do here is add some information on the home that points to other APIs that are available to users. So the way we can do it in a couple different ways. We can do something like clients, or seems like a good start, with a link. So this is, is one way to kind of do this. We can basically just list possible APIs people can hit. But instead, I want to do something else. I'm going to use a standard format for this kind of stuff. It's called HAL. HAL stands for, what does it stand for? HAL. Here, Hypermedia application language. So this is a very simple JSON format that has some opinions around how links appear in responses. So that's exactly what we're going to use. So it's a links object, and a links object can have basically a list of links in them. So the links that I'm going to use is I'm going to use client collection. This is just a convention because what I actually want to do is I want to point this link to a list of clients. So there's two ways to kind of two naming conventions that are possible. You can have just the word client and clients, basically just add an S to make it plural. There's some words that are kind of awkward because maybe the singular version also ends with an S. So what I prefer to do is do something like client lists or client, in this case, client collection. Collection is a pretty common word for in APIs to as a designation for a list of something. So client collection has an href, so that means that if somebody hits the /client endpoint, they will get the whole list. And you can also, if you want to, you can give it a title. List of clients. There you go. So what's nice about a HAL browser is that it knows about HAL links, and so it, instead of showing all the JSON for this, it will immediately just turn it into a kind of a nicer formatted thing. So we have clients, and let's stick with clients for now. That's like, this is a good starting point. Cool, so now this is a real link. I can click it and I should get a 404. Yep. Okay, so kind of interesting to note here is that, as you can see, the 404 response is also JSON. This uses something called application/problem plus JSON. It's a standard format for errors. But also it looks ugly, and the reason it's looking ugly is because I didn't entirely correctly set up the order of this right. This is the problem middleware, and what a problem middleware does is that if there's an exception somewhere, it will create this format. And as you might remember, we added the browser middleware a little later. But if we move this up to above problem, then the browser middleware can also handle these error responses. It's a bit nicer. I think it could still be nicer, but yeah, it's better than it was. Cool. So we have 404 for client. So let's start working on the client endpoints. I think the way a lot of people structure these kind of applications is like backend applications, is that they'll either use top-level folders like controller, view, model, service, and then in each of those folders there's just the full list of all controllers. So a controller directory might have the home control, the client, the entry, the user, all those entries. Another way people do this is instead of categorizing everything by what kind of thing it is, they categorize it by feature. I think the feature categorization works a lot better because usually if I'm working on one feature, for instance, I'm looking at the client's feature in this case, I'm probably going to be touching all the files related to that feature. Whereas that I rarely feel like I'm working currently on all the controllers. And also I think if a lot of applications, as they grow, they will get a lot of controllers, and this just you end up with this feature with, I think, generally smaller directories of stuff. Yeah, so I'm going to start working on a client controller. So let's start at the beginning. Router client. And what I want to, the controller I want to make here is the client collection controller. Maybe I can actually just remove the word controller from here, so it does seem like unnecessary in this case. So client collection. And the next route is I want to make an endpoint for one specific client. So that's a client. Cool, so these are the two controllers I'm going to be working on next. So I'm making a client directory, and this client directory is going to have a controller directory, and is also going to have a formats directory. I think that's all we need for now. Cool. All right, so there's two controllers. There's a collection and an item. So because we're in the client directory structure, we basically can just name these collection item because it will refer to either the group of clients or a single client. Okay, so another thing that I tend to always do is that not everyone does. There's also just kind of two main styles to create controllers, and I'm just going to show an example of that. So I would say this is the Rails way, and which has been adopted in a lot of different places. So the idea with the Rails way is that you typically have one controller, and then that controller has a couple of functions that constitute different CRUD-like operations on this controller. So that might be a create function, a update function, a read function, a delete function, and an index function. So these are so this is CRUD plus the ability to list things. I don't do that because I feel that APIs typically follow a pretty standard structure in terms of how HTTP requests are mapped to endpoints. So what I like to do is, so let's call this the Rails way, and let's call my style the resource-oriented way. So what I want to do is I want to have two classes, which is a collection class and an item class. And now we actually want to just use these methods and kind of categorize them. So item now has a get, which returns a single item, and it has a put that updates an item, and it has a delete that deletes an item. So these directly map to HTTP methods. So on the collection side, we don't no longer use the word index, we can just use get, because we are now getting an entire collection. To create a new item in a collection, it's very typical to use a post method, so I'm going to use post for that. So this is how we're going to map these different CRUD operations to our classes, and this is why I have two controllers. I find that this tends to work better because not everything fits in this exact CRUD style box. Sometimes you need to have other kinds of requests. So having one controller per route, I think, makes it just extremely clear how these things interact together and what kind of URL patterns can be expected for each. Cool, so let's get started with that. I'm going to actually just keep using this, and I'm going to move this to item. So I want to do the collection one first because that's the first one we'll see. But I need to make a couple of changes. So first of all, I need to export this class. Is that true? Actually, I think I don't export class. I think I export an instance. Yeah. Okay. So we create a client collection class. It is helpful to have a good name here, even though we don't. It doesn't look like we need a name outside this because I'm going to default export this. It's useful to give it a good name because if there's errors, this name will bubble up. Cool. So what I need to do next is export a instance of this because we don't create one of these objects per iteration. We just create the controller once. So controllers aren't really used here as the kind of traditional way to, class. We're not really using class in a traditional way where we deal with multiple instances or inheritance or all those things. It's just a convenient way to wrap a couple of functions together. So you might say, oh, why do you use a class? You can just use a straight up object for this. And that's because we're actually going to extend a different class in a sec. So export default const. Does this work? Yeah, I think so. New client collection. Okay, let's see how home did it. I forgot the syntax. Export default, new. Oh, it's just no const. That kind of makes sense. This const, I guess, you need to follow it up with a name. So there we go. That worked. Next thing is, so now we're actually going to handle the extend it from something, and we're going to extend it from the Curveball controller. So what this controller actually does is it makes sure that when a HTTP request is submitted to this endpoint, it starts the right method. So it actually kicks off get or kicks off post if it was one of those HTTP methods. So it handles like a lot of the magic for us. So all we need to do is use this controller as a base class, and you add it to your routes, and then that part works. You can also see we're now down to 1 error instead of 2. Alright, so what does the get request receive? So that's a couple of different things. Actually, it's just the context. So, if you're used to Express, then you're probably used to seeing every endpoint getting a request and a response object. For Curveball, I chose to put those together in a single context. So you have context.request and context.response. This idea is taken from Koa, and there's a lot of stuff here that probably might look a little similar to use Koa, and that's because when I worked on Curveball for the first time, I was heavily inspired by it. Just unhappy with some core aspects of Koa that could only be solved by completely rewriting it. And so this is why I decided to make Curveball. And one of the things that I liked about the context object is that there's a couple of things that are related to HTTP requests. And you kind of, for all those things, you need to kind of decide, is this part of the request or is it part of the response? And a whole bunch of those things didn't super make sense to me to be part of either. For instance, let's see. I think, for instance, this is one of the examples, is that the IP address has to do with request or response. It's related to both. So we can get the IP from the HTTP client that's using this. I don't know if that's the best example. We also have some others like send informational, so send 101 responses. State, which is kind of a general object for kind of adding your own information. Yeah, so there's a couple of things that made more sense to me as kind of part of a global object, and it's easier to extend kind of this global context now instead of trying to figure out, oh, is this a request or response feature? Session data is another one that I didn't feel like strictly fits into the request or response box. So this is why there's a context object, and actually, I think in most cases, this makes everything a little simpler. Anyway, so let's work on our get request. So for the get request, I want to do two things. Set a type to how, and set the body. So again, we're making a formatter or view. We prefer that terminology. So I'm gonna make two views, collection, item. Not gonna do anything with these yet. Returning empty bodies. Oh, not default. There we go. Cool. Down to one error. Okay, I'm not sure why this is erroring right now. Okay, it's only seems to be erroring in my editor, and it's not erroring on my terminal. So sometimes the Typescript plugin for Vim doesn't immediately pick up changes, especially when dealing with file changes. So I'm gonna just ignore this and just use the bottom screen here to to look for errors. So anyway, there I just the only error I'm getting, it says that the item file is not a module yet. That makes all sense because I didn't actually make that that controller yet. So I'm just going to cheat and copy all of this stuff from the collection. It's going to be pretty similar. Moving posts. There we go. Cool. So no more errors, so we should be able to run this. Yeah, that works. Okay, cool. We're getting a response. You can also check here with curl, see if we get the same response. Curl. There you go, an empty object. Yeah, so this browser stuff, like it also knows that like you're using a real browser or you used curl. If you use curl, you actually get the real JSON back. And it's just in browsers where you get all this fancy HTML. Cool. So I'm going to, I think next thing is we actually want to return something for clients. So first of all, we need to make a type for that. I'm going to make a kind of global types directory. And maybe I'll actually just do a global types file, just so everything is nicely together. Yeah, so you can either, like, this types file I like to use for just stuff that's going to be reusable in a lot of different places. So we're gonna need a type for our client, and it's gonna have a name. Actually, it's going to use this file because I wrote down earlier exactly kind of what I wanted here. Clients are gonna have an ID. Oh yeah, I'm gonna use a number for that. A name, a date. No, wait, that's enough. Okay, next, a project. A number, a name, and it's always associated to a client. What else? A person. So in my case, it's just me, but we want to make this multi-user. And lastly, an entry. ID, number, date. Okay, actually, so date I actually want to refer to something like an actual date and not a date and time. So it makes more sense to me to actually just make this a string. Number of minutes we worked on something, who did it, and what project. Cool. Okay, all these need to be exported. All right, so next step is like this. For this collection, we actually want to have a list of clients. So this will have to render that. So it's going to be an argument. So the idea here is that these formatter functions are usually synchronous. They don't do any lookups themselves. All they're responsible for is taking an object from our domain model and creating a rendering for that. So an item will need a single client. Cool. So we can actually start returning something. Name client dot name. Wait. All right. Okay. This is of course necessary for a single item. So for now, I just want to make this work. Clients is client dot. Maybe we'll just call it this. So easy enough. We'll just show the entire object. Okay, cool. Get 2 errors because now our controllers are not actually passing this. So now we're down to the next step, which is we have our controllers that call these formatter functions, and now we need to actually somehow obtain the data that we eventually want to render. So I'm going to make a next kind of object for this. So I'm going to make a service. So it's the client service. So the client service goal is to get stuff from our database, so that the controller can use this. It shouldn't know anything about HTTP. It only knows about the domain model, basically. So for now, in this session, I'm not going to actually integrate a database. I'm going to leave that for the next episode, I suppose, if I'm going to do more of these. And so for now, I'm just going to do everything static, so you can kind of see how this would work. So I can also import the client type. And I'm going to make two functions, find all and find by ID. Oh, almost got it right. Wait, I'm still doing it wrong. Sorry, I was distracted. ID number client. Okay. Both of these need to be exported. And eventually these will become async functions, and that will be pretty easy to upgrade to that. Okay, so I'm going to be very lazy. I'm going to hard code these clients. Oops, sorry. The one name is, I'm going to use the name of my company. And I'm going to, what am I going to do for this? I'm going to use one of my favorite coffee places. In Toronto. There. So that's fine. Next one, we need to implement this one as well. So also doing a very lazy version of this. Actually. Okay, so this looks through the list of clients, so the ID matches. It will find the client, so it's still giving an error because if someone requested a client with an ID that didn't exist in the system, this client variable will be undefined. So TypeScript is telling us you need to handle that. So I am going to actually handle that by throwing an error. Cool, no more errors. So my idea about what to do for basically like a function like find by ID is intended to return a single client or nothing if it can be found. So there's two things you can do. You can either return something like null or undefined, or you can throw in an exception. For anything that's is supposed to find a singular item, I always throw an exception because it makes sense to me. So not everyone in the call stack needs to worry about handling this error, because the error will just bubble up all the way to the error handler. For things like collections, so say this is a very simple find all function. It doesn't do any filtering, but say if in the future we have, a search function that searches all clients with a certain name. So for those cases, I wouldn't throw an exception. I would return an empty array, because if I'm searching for something and there are 0 results, it doesn't mean that the collection doesn't exist. It just means that the collection is empty. So I think it's perfectly acceptable to return an empty set if nothing matched. But for anything that is supposed to return a singular item, an exception is the most appropriate to me. Cool, so we have our find all, find by ID. So now we just have to hook them up. So the ID comes from our routes. So let's go to our routes. So we have our two routes for the collection and a singular item. So the colon syntax turns this part into a variable. So what I actually want to do is I want to turn this into client ID instead of just plain ID, because it will be more clear, especially if we have longer paths with multiple variables. So to extract that in the collection, we can do ctx.params.client ID. So it's still complaining about this because this function wants a number and the parameter is always strings, so we can just cast it to a number. So it's kind of funky because like plusing a string basically automatically casts a string to a number, and you might think in TypeScript it would want to prevent these kind of accidental casts, but TypeScript recognizes a couple of syntaxes that people specifically often use for casting between different types. And this is one of those examples. So this always makes sure that, if we have a number, it will be cast to, if you have a string that contains a number, it will be correctly cast to a number. And TypeScript is just aware of this pattern and accepts it as a possible way to do this. Cool, so we have 0 errors now. Let's take a look. Cool, so we have our client's endpoint now returns 2 clients, the one from the system. And so I'm going to make one more change to this, which is I want to change the formats of this because Hal has an opinion about how things like collections are structured. I just don't have a very strong opinion, but maybe it's more mine than Hal's. So first, we want to basically use links for this again. So in the links, I want to at least set a self link. It's just useful to have something pointing to its own URL. And then each item is going to be a link. So we're using the name for the link title. One thing I like to do is just show the total number of items that are in here. Excuse me. Okay, what did I do wrong? Oh yeah, this is wrong too, and this needs to be clients. Okay, slot B. Cool, so now we have a list of clients showing up as links. So let's see if that worked. It did not. Oh, because I need to not wrap this in another array. There you go, 2 clients, client 1 and client 2. Last thing I'm going to change is this format. So I want to do a very similar thing. First of all, I want to have a self link. This is just not absolutely required, but it's just a good habit, and I'm going to show in a second why. So you may have noticed that in the previous example, the self link doesn't show up. The help browser hides it because it kind of knows that it always points to itself. It's not that useful for an end user. Next thing, I also want, I usually like to add another link that points from any resource back to the collection it's in, if it's in the collection. Cool. All right, so you didn't see anything change here, except this button is now new because there's certain types of collections or certain types of link types, link relationships like collection, that are recognized as special by the browser, and one of those things is the word collection. So if you use the word collection, this browser will always render this button. So last thing is that, so right now we have a list of links here, but it doesn't actually contain the bodies of any of the clients. So say if a client has a lot more information, it means that an HTTP client needs to go to each of these endpoints and get all the information. So this could be an issue for performance later. So HAL does have an answer to that as well. So instead of coming up with new formats specifically for collections and non-collections, HAL basically says that what we're going to do is we're going to take the entire body and we're going to embed it back into another resource. So there's another special property name, so it's embedded. And with embedded, we're basically saying we have a list of items here, and now we're going to embed these items back into the collection. It's very simple because we already have a list of clients and we already have a function that generates the HAL format for each client. So let's take a look. Cool, so there we go. So now these two are embedded. And this means that a real client will be able to just get the entire list all at once. This is also why we wanted the self link, because it actually, when we embed stuff, the self link is used to determine what the actual URL was of each item that we embedded. Cool, so yeah, let's also just open it with curl. So you see the same response. It's a bit jumbled. So we can pipe it to a tool called JQ, which is very useful. And it gives us a nice format. So here you see all our JSON. So a client would use this JSON to get all the data. So it looks a bit verbose, so more verbose than you used to. And if you're completely write clients from scratch for every case, that might be a little annoying. But once we start integrating with this API, we're actually going to use a client that understands HAL and kind of abstracts all this stuff away from you. Cool, so that was kind of my last step here. I think the next time what I want to do is add database support to this, so we don't just have a hard-coded list of clients, but we can actually take it from a real database. So I'm just going to use MySQL, and then we're also going to add read-write support to this. Cool, so yeah, I hope that was interesting. And I hope the keyboard clackiness wasn't too insane. So we'll find out later, I guess. All right. Have a great day. Bye.